Picture this. You're a soldier in the 1700s. Your commanding officer walks in with your deployment orders. You open the envelope, and there it is, Caribbean. Today, you'd probably be doing backflips. Beach deployment? Sign me up. But back then, soldiers literally tried to mutilate themselves to avoid going. Some straight up deserted. Others just accepted their fate and said goodbye to their families. Because in the 18th century, getting deployed to the Caribbean wasn't a vacation. It was basically a death sentence. So what turned paradise into a graveyard? Let's talk about it. Why everyone wanted the Caribbean even though it was hell. Here's the thing. The Caribbean wasn't just valuable. It was absurdly valuable. We're talking about sugar. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Sugar? Really? But listen, sugar in the 1700s was like oil in the 1900s. It was liquid gold. The West Indies alone exported over 4 million pounds worth of goods in 1770. Cotton? That was pocket change, just 500 pounds. Everything else was sugar, molasses, and rum. The whole economy ran on these three products. It wasn't even close. This made the islands incredibly strategic. Every major empire wanted them. Britain, France, Spain, they were all fighting over these tiny pieces of land. And that meant garrisons, lots of them. You needed soldiers to defend against rival empires, fight off pirates. Yeah, this was the golden age of piracy. And, here's the dark part, suppress slave rebellions. Because here's what nobody really talks about. The conditions were so brutal that plantation owners worked enslaved people to death and just imported more. It was cheaper to replace them than to keep them alive. The enslaved population couldn't even maintain their numbers through birth. They were dying that fast. That's how horrific the working conditions were. But if it was terrible for enslaved people, it was also a nightmare for European soldiers. Just a different kind of nightmare. The climate from hell. Let's start with water, or rather the lack of it. Most Caribbean islands had almost no natural fresh water. Antigua, a few brackish springs that tasted awful, and some streams that were dry most of the year. So what did they do? Collected rainwater in huge cisterns. Great during the rainy season, absolute disaster during droughts. One British officer recorded that from January to June 1804, basically no rain fell. They were on severe water rations. They had to ship barrels of water from neighboring islands just to survive. Imagine fighting in tropical heat with barely enough water to drink. Heat exhaustion and dehydration killed soldiers before they even saw combat. And then there were the hurricanes. These things would just appear and obliterate everything. Barracks destroyed, supplies ruined, ships sunk. The islands were hit so regularly that you just had to expect it and try to rebuild afterward. But the real killer was disease. Yellow fever, the invisible enemy. If you were a European soldier stationed in the Caribbean, yellow fever was your worst nightmare. They called it Yellow Jack, and for good reason. First, you'd get a fever. Then your skin would turn yellow from liver failure. Then you'd start bleeding from everywhere, your mouth, your nose, your eyes, and then you'd die. The mortality rates were insane. In some regiments, 2/3 of the officers died from disease alone, not battle, disease. Regular soldiers had it even worse. One account mentions a regiment losing half its men in a single year. Another talks about hospitals so full of dying men that they couldn't even properly care for them. And here's the kicker. Nobody knew what caused it. They thought it was bad air or miasma from swamps. They had no idea mosquitoes were spreading it. So all their preventative measures, completely useless. Malaria was the other big one. It would hit you with fever, chills, and fatigue. It could kill you, or it could just leave you permanently weak. Either way, you weren't an effective soldier anymore. The heat itself made everything worse. Soldiers were wearing heavy wool uniforms designed for European weather, in tropical heat, combined with hard physical labor, poor food, contaminated water, and constant disease exposure. It was a perfect storm of misery. One officer, young Horatio Nelson, who later became a legendary naval commander, called the Caribbean a hellhole, and he wasn't wrong. So how do you get soldiers to go? So, imagine you're the British Army trying to staff these garrisons. You need thousands of soldiers, but nobody wants to go. What do? You get creative. And by creative, I mean you scrape the bottom of the barrel. Regiments bound for the Caribbean got the worst recruits. Old men, boys, people who couldn't get accepted anywhere else. One commander complained that his regiment was a disaster. Officers missing, companies with no leadership, and everyone trying to get leave to abandon ship. He'd only granted leave to 2 men. One had leprosy, one was seriously ill, and one was good for nothing. If you were a regular soldier, the options were grimmer. You couldn't buy your way out, you couldn't just go home. Some deserted, others mutinied, and some, this is dark, injured themselves so badly they'd be declared unfit for service. There's a famous case. The Black Watch Regiment was marching from Scotland to London. A rumor spread that they were being sent to the Caribbean. 100 men immediately deserted. They got caught, and while only 3 were executed, 38 of them were punished by being sent to, you guessed it, the West Indies. Whether that was better than hanging, nobody can say. Sometimes soldiers weren't even told where they were going until they were already on the ships. Middle of the ocean, can't turn back, and then, surprise, we're going to the Caribbean. The voyage itself was brutal. 6 to 8 weeks at sea, sometimes longer. About 10% of each regiment died before even arriving. Cramped conditions, bad food, disease spreading through the ship. Many saw the Caribbean islands for the first time in a coffin. The graveyard. Here's the brutal reality. No regiment ever arrived at the Caribbean at full strength, and they never reached full strength while stationed there either. Instead, they just maintained this grim cycle. Men died from disease, heat, and exhaustion. Fresh recruits, often unwilling or tricked, would arrive to replace them. Those new guys would die, more recruits would come, over and over. These weren't lush tropical paradises. They were graveyards at the edge of empire, forgotten by the people who sent soldiers there. The Caribbean generated incredible wealth for European powers through sugar and slavery, but for the men stationed there, whether enslaved or in uniform, it was a death sentence wrapped in palm trees. So, next time you see those beautiful Caribbean beaches in a travel ad, just remember, a few centuries ago, seeing those islands on your deployment papers meant you probably wouldn't be coming home.